Good morning, everyone. Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm Tenzin Doma. I'm Program Coordinator at Tibet House Culture Center of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and I'll be moderating today's inaugural session. On behalf of Tibet House Culture Center of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, New Delhi, I would like to extend our warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Mr. Ashish Kotari ji, founder of Kalprish and the co-author and the co-editor of Churning of the Earth, Alternative Future, Pluriverse, a Post-Development Dictionary. Venerable Geshe Dorje Damdila, Director of Tibet House Culture Center of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, New Delhi. And our convener, Professor Kaveri Gilji, Professor at Shiv Nadar University, New Delhi. Our esteemed chairpersons and speakers gathered here, and also particularly for the participants who are gathered here for the conference on the ecological imperative and ethical interdependence, possibilities for the 21st century. Thank you. Now, I would like to request our keynote speaker, Mr. Ashish Kotari ji, Venerable Geshe Dorje Damdila, Professor Kaveri Gilji, our chairpersons, Professor Rajeshwari Raina ji, Professor Savita Kekar ji, Professor Rohit Negi ji, and Ms. Gauri Gilji to kindly light the lamp of wisdom and request to take their respective seats on their dais, please. Thank you. And Tibet House, New Delhi continues to follow the vision of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama in organizing these series of one-day conferences, such as right now we are having the ecological imperative and the ethical interdependence possibilities for 21st century conferences, wherein eminent scholars from various disciplines will share their valuable inputs and address the critical issues on ecology. Before we begin the actual session, I would like to briefly introduce you all about the Tibet House and its activities. Tibet House, New Delhi was established in 1965 by His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet for the purpose of preserving the cultural heritage of Tibet at the time when it faced the extinction in its homeland, as well as for providing a center for Tibetan culture and Buddhist studies. His Holiness the Dalai Lama's recurring emphasis on developing a sense of universal harmony and compassion as its own effective antidote to global suffering, together with the needs for a meaningful exchange between different religious and cultural tradition, also had a profound effect on the purpose and also its activities on Tibet House. Tibet House New Delhi aims to bring together Buddhist masters, Tibetologists, people across the different disciplines, students and practitioners, and the common man through the various programs and events. Tibet House continues to expand its objectives in saving Tibet's heritage and in exploring and working towards the Tibet House potential contribution towards the ethical development of the modern society. Over a period of 5 decades, since its inception, Tibet House has come to recognize as a significant institution for the dissemination of Tibetan culture and for the Buddhist studies. Tibet House has a library, museum, various study programs on Buddhist philosophy, conferences on interdisciplinary subjects such as neuroscience, Buddhist psychology, quantum physics, spiritual ecology, Padmapani lectures, and universal ethics conferences. A publication unit which publishes around 10 to 15 books a year, and program division which regularly organizes lectures, seminars, conferences, film screenings, and exhibitions. Tibet House also offers 4 different courses on Buddhist philosophy, psychology, and also Tibetan language course particularly. Firstly, the first batch of Nalanda Master's course, which was launched on 9th December 2016 on the occasion of 51st anniversary of Tibet House, New Delhi, in the gracious presence of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, along with Sri Kiran Rajuji, the Union Minister of Home Affairs, and Sri Najib Jung, Lieutenant Governor of Delhi. The first batch of Nalanda Master's course is completed with 372 students from 44 different countries. And the second batch of Nalanda Master's course on Buddhist philosophy has already started in July, and which is around 900 participants enrolled from 54 different countries. Secondly, the Nalanda Diploma course, which was launched on 2018. 3 batches have been successfully completed so far. Nalanda Diploma course, which is a 14-month course, and this course is designed specifically to accommodate people who are more serious into Buddhist philosophy while being in the midst of busy schedule with their other engagements and commitments. Till now, we have successfully completed with 3 batches, and the 4th batch of Nalanda Diploma course is now being offered both online and offline. Tibet House also offer Tibetan language course on a regular basis. There are 4 different levels of learning offered at a very nominal with a special concession for students and monastics. Till date, 24 batches have been successfully completed. And for now, the new 25th batch, which is both online and offline, is going to offer soon in the month of June 2023. Now, I would like to request Venerable Geshe Dorje Damdila, Director of Tibet House, New Delhi, to kindly address the gathering, please.
Good morning, all of you. Respected keynote speaker, Mr. Ashish Kothariji, and Professor Ecological, our convener for this program, and also Professor Savitaji from Goa University, and Professor Rajeshwariji, Professor Rohitji, and Miss the Goriji, and all the participants here. Is a great the joy that Tibet House has been involved with various facets of the human endeavors, such as the creating platforms for the various dialogues, conferences in modern sciences, quantum physics, neuroscience, versus the philosophy of Shunyata from the different traditions of the different religious traditions of the world, and also on ecology, and likewise organizing exhibitions and so forth, and giving scholarships to the primarily for the students and for the scholars. So with this in mind, today at this conference, we feel that it's extremely important for us to pay attention to the ecology. Everywhere we see that there is a downgrading on the area of the ecology, where the excessive mining and so forth happening is all out of the greed. And we see that oftentimes in the scriptures, particularly in the ancient classical Indian traditions, the scriptures there mention the ordinary people as like small children, meaning that small children, they cannot see what is tomorrow, and they cannot see the long term, the consequences, and then they just act so impulsively, and because of which that there's a tremendous disaster to the world happening. And then the good people who really have the potential to create a change in the world, they don't get any, nobody pays heed to them, and then only those people who are there, who are in a way like these seems like influencers, actually creating a disaster to the world, and they become so popular and everybody following. The small children, they follow small children. So this is what the world is today, so unfortunately. But if Dr. Dojila, please come. If we are to if we are to feel demoralized because of these gestures of the small children-like people, and in the area of the ecology, the finance, administration, education, including medical science, where even some of the professors in medical science, they are like small children. They teach their students while they already made the commitment, they took the Hippocrates oath. But what they teach the students is that, if you join this discipline, you will not get money. This is how they've been taught, that there is so much of work and you don't get money. This is how unfortunately, this is what is happening all over the world in various disciplines. So, as we can see here, the speakers here, I know many of them personally, and they have an incredibly good heart for the world. So, the good people, the like-minded people should come together and work for the welfare of the world. So with this in mind, I just like to share some of my thoughts, which I usually share pertaining to ecology. So first of all, why is the ecology so important? From how the people in the countries actively destroy the environment in all sorts of forms, like heavy deforestation and Amazon rainforest fires, nuclear proliferation, and so forth, people are given the impression that ecology is the least important of all. This is all our naivety. COVID-19 reminded us that our well-being is the most important thing. The money and the wealth for which we are destroying the environment is not the end, but not to be forgotten. That they are the most important and they are not the most, but a superficial means to the end. The end is the well-being of the citizens of the world, as visibly taught to us by COVID-19. The whole world has to remain locked down during the COVID-19. Nations have to lose and sacrifice trillions of dollars. And they have to sacrifice the education of their children in schools, colleges, and universities. This is well highlighted in the 17 SDGs enumerated by UNO, more precisely in the first three forms: no poverty, no hunger, good health, and well-being. From the space, if you look at the various celestial objects, there is only one planet which starkly stands out as the most beautiful one. exuding the blue hues, is the planet Earth, our home. If we lose this, the whole inhabitants will die, and there is no other planet for us to escape to. This is well reflected in the book, Our Only Home, by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when he said, "Yesterday, our beautiful planet, the blue planet, was still a natural paradise in many areas. Today, it is already withered in many places, and tomorrow it will be uninhabitable in many regions if we just carry on as before." He also said in the foreword to the book, Ecological Responsibility, a Dialogue with Buddhism, published by Tibet House, Delhi in 1997. Resolving the environmental crisis is not just a question of ethics, but a question of our own survival. The natural environment is very important, not only for those of us alive, but also for future generations. If we exploit it in extreme ways, even though we may get money or other benefits from it now, in the long run, we ourselves and future generations will suffer. The Buddha exhorted, all phenomena of pleasant and unpleasant nature arise from their respective causes. It is pertinent to study and identify the causes of the ecological crisis. Some of the causes of the man-made environmental degradations are ozone depletion, excessive deforestation, greenhouse effect, water pollution or air pollution, nuclear waste dumping, excessive meat consumption, and so forth. The immediate cause of these is our attempt to feed our endless greed. The greed is because of ignorance, which fails to see the interdependent nature of the fragile planet Earth as a habitat, and human beings and animals as inhabitants. Inhabitants will perish when the world as the habitat perishes. Let us look at how tsunami washes away everything: your house, your children, your family, your money, including your bank, like small matchboxes being washed away by a flood. In the Buddhist texts, where the beings are oftentimes referred to as a childish. It is a child who throws stones to the glass house one takes shelter in, and to regret at the end of the loss of the shelter when one suffers from cold, rain, and so forth. Dr. Franz Olt said in the book, Our Only Home, a climate appeal to the world, journey written by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, where it says, every day we're emitting globally about 150 million tons of carbon dioxide. And every day we're killing off about 150 animals and plant species. We're losing daily 50,000 tons of fertile soil, and deserts grow by about 80,000 hectares every day. Our greed for meat destroys rainforests. In 2019, hundreds of thousands of Africans lived through the most terrible drought without a living memory, within the living memory, and are fearful of the next famine. The whole subcontinent is crying for water. His Holiness, in his address on June 7, 1992, to the Parliamentary Earth Summit Global Forum of the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, he said, "This blue planet of ours is a delightful habitat, is our life, is future, our future. Indeed, the earth acts like a mother to us all. Like children, we are dependent on her. In the face of such global problems as the greenhouse effect and depletion of the ozone layer, individual organizations and single nations are helpless. Unless we all work together, no solutions can be found. Our Mother Earth is teaching us a lesson in universal responsibility." Now, where lies the solution? Let us look at some of these 17 these Sustainable Development Goals as highlighted by UNO. Clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on earth. We need collective efforts on the international level. Leaders play a great role, should play a great role. For example, handling COVID is not that one nation can do. I'm so impressed to hear Mr. Blinken, the Secretary of State of USA, during the meeting we had on the first day of his visit to India, 2021, where he said that no one nation, I was there as part of the meeting, and he addressed this. He said that no one nation can do anything to curb the virus, COVID-19. It should be a collective effort of all the countries. And individual citizens, also we need to, as individual citizens, we also need to take responsibility in this effort. It was very inspiring to see His Holiness the Dalai Lama emphasizing a lot on preservation of the ecology during the public teachings in Sarnath, India, on 29 December 1990, the place where the Buddha gave his first sermon. There, His Holiness the Dalai Lama distributed lots of fruit-bearing tree seeds, which he bought from the monetary part of the Nobel Peace Prize of 1989, thus inspiring all his followers and admirers to replenish the environment with love and care. His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, "Since I too have a responsibility in this matter, that is to work for the protection of the environment and to see that the present and the future generations of the mankind can make use of refreshing shade and the fruits of trees, I bought these seeds of fruit-bearing trees with part of my Nobel Prize money to be distributed now to people representing different regions. All the continents of the world are represented here and doing this cultural gathering. These seeds have been kept near the Kalachakra mandala for purification and blessings, since these include seeds of apricot, walnut, papaya, and guava, etc., suitable for planting under varying geographical conditions. Experts in respective places should be consulted when they're planting with care, and thus you all should see that my sincere aspiration is fulfilled." One distinctive yet very noble mindset I notice in the people who love and stand for the environment is that they will never engage in killing another human being, human brother or sister, which means no terrorism. They care for life. If this altruistic compassion, which drives them to become a noble being, as opposed to selfish persons, can be taught to the world leaders and common people alike, the world is going to be a very different place, a place of worship, and a real peace and kindness by the present and the future generations. How can we teach this altruistic heart to the people? This next question. It always intrigues me to see that what His Holiness the Dalai Lama says resonates with that of what Albert Einstein thought when the latter said, a human being, this is Einstein saying, a human being is a part of the whole world, called by us as universe, a part, limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is like a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task now must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening a circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Every time His Holiness gives public addresses within or outside India, experts come with the same question: where are we as a world going wrong? That world crisis keep increasing despite the great advancement in the modern education. His Holiness, without second thought, responds: the well-being of the world is determined by the development of both the brain and the heart. Unfortunately, the modern education is designed to develop only the brain and not the heart. Now is the high time that we introduce programs for heart development as part of the modern education program, the system. It has been one of the greatest efforts of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in this pursuit of introducing universal ethics, which eventually culminated into the launch of an extremely important and efficacious program, a gift and a legacy for the world, known as social, emotional, ethical learning, commonly known as C-learning, as a great mission of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, undertaken by Emory University, Atlanta, Georgia, USA, which was globally launched in April 2019. Any institutions or even individuals can take the maximum benefit from this program. All materials are available for free. Even teacher trainings are given for free for the institutions. This is also to bring it to your attention that many institutions from across the globe have been receiving the benefit of this program. I hope and pray that this program of the universal ethics, as envisioned by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, will soon one day be picked up by UNO for the world. I'm confident that many future generations will reap the benefit to change the course of the world from darkness of ignorance and miseries to the light of happiness, equality, breathing the fresh air of compassion and harmony among the world's citizens. Let me read a verse from the poem His Holiness the Dalai Lama wrote for ecology, and another verse which His Holiness always recites for the joy of the entire world of sentience and non-sentience. The poem reads, just one verse, two verses, one for the ecology and one for his own sentiments for the world. Being attentive to the nature of interdependence of all creatures, both animate and inanimate, one should never slacken in one's efforts to preserve and conserve nature's energy. As long as space remains, as long as sentient beings remain, may to remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Venerable Geshe Tajud Amdullah. Now I would like to request Professor Kaveri Gilji, Professor at Shiv Nada University, to kindly share a few words of the conference.
Thank you so much, Chadomala, Tashidele, and good morning to all of you, respected panelists, chairpersons, and the audience. So when Geshe-la, the director of Tibet House, requested about helping convene a conference on the environment, it'll be a story about interdependence, and I'll just tell you how. So one of the most moving books that I read in the last years is called My Tibetan Childhood, When Ice Shattered Stone by Nakshang Nulo, and it's published by Duke University Press in 2014. And in this book, this individual has lived in Tibet throughout. This book has been published originally in Tibetan, and I understand that's much more beautiful than the English, but the English just left me sleepless nights. In it, he describes his childhood in 1950s Tibet, when the communists are coming in, they are taking over the country, and his father is a nomad, and they travel from East Tibet to go to Lhasa for a pilgrimage, and their mother passes away. And the father teaches them. So on the way, they see all kinds of wildlife, wild wolves, animals, birds, and the relationship to nature that the father teaches them. For example, how to see that a sandstorm is coming, which can be a question of life and death in those parts. And then they return to their home, and thereafter the father passes away. And these two boys, it's him and his brother, they are only able to survive the famine that follows thereafter because the father has taught them how to engage with nature and survive. So Tibet House, of course, was formed in 1964. It is the cultural center of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Delhi. And as Geshe-la mentioned, His Holiness has spoken about the environment over decades. And of course, this book came out in 2018, Ecology, Ethics and Interdependence. It was born of a Mind and Life conference on this issue. And His Holiness has spoken about the Earth as our only mother or planet home. He's also spoken about the legal rights of nature and animals. And in this regard, I also want to say that it really shook the present dispensation in China, because a few years ago, His Holiness requested Tibetans not to wear animal skins to stay warm. And in the whole of Tibet, there were, nomads and others who absolutely refused to do so. And that shook the government, because obviously, though he's been in exile for decades, his word carries, means so much in Tibet to date. But at the heart of what he says about the planet and ecology and the environment is really about interdependence. Interdependence, as we will see in the sessions today, between human, animal, intergenerational, and the ethics of it. And he talks about a universal responsibility. So here today at this conference, And when I was asked to help, the first thing that came to mind, my colleague Rajeshwari Rena, Professor Rajeshwari Rena, had organized a conference on alternative futures and degrowth and thinking about a post-development world in September of last year. And in fact, Ashish Kothari ji was part of it, and there are others here who were, and there was a lot of deliberation on this question. So Vasu, here, my other colleague from Shivnada, and so there was a lot of deliberation on this question. So today, of course, we have three panels. Number one, so they aim to explore interrelation and contestations at three different scales and registers. First, economy and climate change politics between the global north of developed countries and the global south. Second, between varied environments and species in the age of the Anthropocene. And third, on disputed frontiers and in the fragile ecologies of the Himalaya and the third pole of Tibet. And there is also a book launch by the photographer Gauri Gale and my sister, who has done decade-long work with Adivasis who face the brunt of development. So the question is really, when we know about the ecological impact and the environmental impact, why are we not moving towards doing something? And there we have to look at the question about development and post-development. So, of course, and in this, the post-structural criticism of development of Escobar and others is well taken. It's aimed at the intentional development agenda of the post-World War II period. Post-developmentalism, which includes radical pluralism, simple living, degrowth, reappraising non-capitalist societies, may be said to encompass a critical stance with respect to established science. As the other day, we had a lecture from Professor Sheila Jasinoff. She's just spoken to the Environment Support Group in Bangalore. Therefore, a lot of our participants are coming late night from there as well. And some couldn't be with us. She gave a keynote lecture for our university the other day. Excellent lecture. A respect for local knowledge systems, cultures, autonomies, and an affinity for localized pluralistic grassroots movements, ideas that come from critics of development in third world countries, who are as diverse as post-structural social theorists, political ecologists, environmentalists, anti-globalization activists. Alternatives to development argued for communitarianism of a sort. And some of the ideas of these post-development thinkers have over the years at least been attempted to be mainstreamed into development theory and practice. For example, the dangers of top-down approaches in favor of more participatory ones, the problems with the uncritical application of scientific and technological solutions to agriculture, industrial production, and various other spheres. I will be speaking about that in my paper. And values other than the economic and material, as even Geshe-la mentioned, such as on the environment, gender, and so on, to be taken into fuller account. Now, the issue here, now this is one, so a critique about development per se. The other thing that has happened recently in academia and more generally is the notions of decoloniality and the ontological turn in the social sciences, which takes the debate into yet another different and even more ambitious terrain, where challenging the very enterprise of social scientific thinking and perceiving the project of development as epistemic violence against non-Western societies. Indeed, along with the idea of development, it rejects the epistemological, ontological, and chronological possibility of a shared scientific tradition. And here we have the keynote speaker will open. This concept of pluriverse, Ashish Kothari was one of the editors of a post-development dictionary. And when I was preparing for Raji's conference in September, I looked at this volume and I found an entry by Keshi Doji Damdullah, and then they know each other for a very long time, but they are meeting today for the first time. So this is all the interdependence. The concept of pluriverse seeks to apply epistemological and ontological plurality by challenging all claims of universality and extending a vast range of ideas, practices, and visions, while consistently not seeking to judge and order them or bring them into conversation with each other. So, for example, I think there are copies outside of Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary that's co-edited with Ashish Kothari and others, where there are entries on ideas on smart cities, on circular economy, BRICS, Buddhist thought on the environment, wisdom-based compassion, all of that, queer, love, alternative currencies, so a range of ideas. So our challenge today, one of the things that this conference is seeking to do is to just look at then how do we sort of, take these very diverse ideas, how to bring them into some sort of shared vision of transformative emancipatory development, because I would argue that that does remain an enduring societal ambition for critical modernists and others. That some basic idea of development is something even a small town, rural India, or anywhere in the world, they are aspiring to that. But when it comes up against the greed of, whether it's nations who are, occupying others for just trying to get their resources and all of that, there'll be a paper on transboundary rivers and the whole issue with Tibetan rivers in today's political dispensation. And also we see with the global north and global south, climate change negotiations are extremely contested because in a way it's denying third world countries a global south. The third world label itself is problematic, but developing countries the same opportunities to perhaps improve standards of living. And also we have to debate those, because tied up with those notions is obviously the notion of power. So with that, I will welcome you all to this conference, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to convene.
Thank you very much, Professor Kaveri Gilji. Now I would like to request our keynote speaker, Mr. Ashish Kothari ji, founder of Kalparish and co-founder and co-editor of Pluriverse and a post-development dictionary, to share a few words on this conference, please.
Can I have Thank you. Thank you, Kaveri, for this invitation, to Geshe-la and everybody else at Tibet House. I learned recently that to avoid this long initial thank yous and all the people on the stage and all of that, we just say all protocols observed. Okay, so please, no disrespect to anybody here, but I'm not going to name everybody and all the dignitaries. I'm going to get straight into my presentation. So, having heard Geshe-la and Kaveri and talk about a number of the issues that I will also talk about, I think there will be probably some repetition, but I think they've already laid some fantastic ground for what I will speak about today. I think we're all familiar with the kinds of crises, and both of them also spoke about some of them. Today, of course, our focus is the ecological, but the ecological cannot be separated from all the other aspects of life, and all of them are in serious crisis, from the very personal in terms of alienation and so on, to the completely global, whether it's climate or the other sorts of crises that we've already heard about. So I won't go into that, because if you make the mistake of reading the morning newspapers or opening any of the news channels, you will be hearing about this all the time, right? So I'm not going to actually go into this. But one of the issues that has clearly come out, and Kaveri also spoke about this briefly, is the question. A big question comes up on the notion of development itself. We know the word actually originates either in biology, for instance, the development of a seed into a plant, into a tree, or a baby from an embryo into a baby into a full human being, or in other ways. Those are sorts of origins of the word. But it first started getting used in the economic context, I would say post-World War II. And from that original notion, where you're trying to actually talk about the development, in that sense, the opposite of envelopment, right? The envelopment is to enclose, development is to open up. So to open up to the flowering of possibilities in all different ways for human beings and the rest of life, it has actually got restricted over the last few decades to just looking at GDP, at finances and financial growth, and economy also from a very narrow perspective. And what that has also then meant is that everything else becomes fodder for this particular vision of economic growth. Virtually every country in the world except Bhutan uses GDP as a notion, as a measure of whether we are developed or not. In fact, my terms for the so-called developed countries are destroyed and destroying countries, and those who are so-called developing are being destroyed countries. So Kaveri, maybe that's the kind of words that you could also be using instead of developed and developing. So in that sense, you see here, you can look at the advertisement here. This is from an Indian multinational corporation talking about nature as a barrier. That itself is one of the biggest mistakes we make. And then to say, if we need development, like laying pipelines, then that barrier has to be removed, as you see here. Probably no advertising agency will repeat an ad like this now. This is about 30 years old, because everybody wants to be seen to be ecologically inclusive. But the notion of development still very much exactly the same. And what we're also doing in this process of development is the conversion of what were livelihoods, which were not jobs. They were occupations that were within ecological, cultural contexts, not necessarily perfect, many problems with them, but they were in that sense, and they're sort of more holistic to what we have now, where those are being destroyed increasingly, and what is being created in the modern economy is jobs, which are separated from all the ecological and cultural and other contexts. And that's why we desperately wait for the weekend, and we desperately wait for our vacations, etc. We've separated jobs and leisure and pleasure. And that's what I call now deadlihoods, or what the late anthropologist David Graeber called bullshit jobs. Excuse me for the... Actually, bullshit is a very good term, because gobar, right? Dung is actually very good. Okay. So we know now very clearly, and this is what even some of the economists are beginning to understand, is that economic growth is inherently unsustainable. You cannot have growth, perpetual growth on a finite planet. We see that with several planetary boundaries already being crossed. We've seen that with the climate crisis, which is already upon us. It's not coming, it's already here. And with so many other things. We know with the ecological footprint network that we are already using 1.5 times what the Earth can actually provide. Along with this, we also actually see tremendous levels of inequality. And the two are connected in very intricate ways. We see, for instance, that this inequality across the world, including in India, is growing exponentially. And in that sense, if you look at development, in a way, it is not that development has not reached the poor, but that development is actually causing this inequality. This is a connection that we begin to understand more and more. We also begin to understand that this notion of development, growth at all costs, is literally at all costs, including the cost of democratic freedoms. We see in today, across the world again, including in India, where people stand up in defense of their territories, their forests, their land, their water, their knowledge, their systems. They are labeled not just as anti-development, but increasingly anti-national or seditionist, including the 5 young people in 2021 who were charged with all kinds of anti-national activities for simply standing up with the farmers' movement or asking about questions about the climate crisis. We also see that the same system that is creating the problems is giving us what it calls solutions. Carbon trading, net zero carbon, in the biodiversity thing, no net loss, or various other such terms that actually begin to come in, new buzzwords that are being created by the same system, not to sustain the earth, but to sustain itself. Sustainable development in that sense, including, I'm afraid, even the SDGs to some extent, are about sustaining the current system, not sustaining the earth, and not talking about removing the kinds of injustices that we're talking about. Finally, if you look at the COVID period, this very strange period we've just been through over the last 2.5, 3 years, we see that, of course, there's a recognition, which Geshe-la brought out, the recognition that the COVID pandemic should have given us the opportunity to think very fundamentally about processes of development, what it is to be human, what is progress, etc. And to some extent it did. But we also saw that the same period was when nation states used this as an opportunity to become even more authoritarian, and corporations as an opportunity to gain that much more profit. You can see the figure up there. That's actually already an old figure. It's probably now many more trillions of dollars of how much profit has been made at a time when hundreds of millions of people actually lost their livelihoods and their jobs. So, but in the COVID pandemic, we also saw the opposite. which is that side of human nature which can extend itself with compassion, with solidarity, with love, and say, we will come and help you. Young people helping the elderly, those who are still healthy helping those who are not well, those who still had jobs or had money helping those who had lost their livelihood. So that expression of solidarity is what I want to focus on today, and not so much the bad news. So that's the end of the bad news. I'm now going to get into what I think is some of the most wonderful things that are happening and how we can kind of enhance those. Because there are two kinds of alternatives. It's not that we are condemned to follow the pathway that the industrialized West has told us. We're not condemned to Margaret Thatcher's dictum of there is no alternative, the Tina dictum. There are two kinds of alternatives. One of them is resistance. This picture is from 1988-89, I think, of Adivasi protest in central India against 2 mega hydroelectricity projects on the Indravati river. And in that protest, they were not just talking about we don't want to be displaced by this dam. There were 300 villages that would have been displaced. We don't want our forests to be drowned, but also that for you, that is to say for the government, they were telling the government, for you, the river is about hydroelectricity and megawatts. For us, the river is our mother. Ye hamari maa hai. We will not allow our mother to be shackled by your dreams of progress. They protested, they actually stopped those 2 dams. It was one of the successful protest movements in that time. So you actually see that in these movements of resistance, you see images and glimpses, sometimes stated, sometimes not stated, of other ways of relating to the rest of nature, of other ways of being, of other ways of dreaming, of other ways of knowing, of other ways of behaving and acting compared to what the mainstream system, created by all the isms that I've put up there, is actually telling us, right? So we really need to listen to these movements, and they're happening across the world. They've been happening, of course, for centuries and for decades, but the more recent ones, the farmers' movement, we all know about in India, the peace movements in Burma, Myanmar, and elsewhere, the anti-racism movements, the youth climate justice movements, the movements for new constitutions in Chile and Colombia and elsewhere. These are all movements of resistance against the current system, but also about creating something new or sustaining from the old what is still relevant. And that's where the second kind of resistance, a second kind of alternative becomes very important, which is people do need food. There is actual poverty, there is deprivation, there is injustice. So how do we deal with that? Not simply by saying no to the current system, which is important, but also yes to what? And that's where we see actually across the world thousands, literally tens of thousands of examples of people creating possibilities for meeting human needs and aspirations without trashing the earth and without creating injustices and inequalities. This book, Kaveri kindly already mentioned, it's available outside, and I'll speak a little bit about it at the end, which has more than 100 examples of these. I'm going to give you very briefly a quick glimpse of some of these. Now, these are very long, detailed stories. I could spend an hour on each one of these stories, and I'd love to because I like storytelling, but I'm going to take just 1 minute each. This is, for me, the most inspiring example from India. 5,000 Dalit women farmers. Everybody is familiar with the caste system. So Dalit women are in fact the most marginalized section of India's society, both because of patriarchy and casteism. And they're very small landholders, 1 acre, 2 acres of land. They were 30 years back facing the same problems that poor families, marginalized families face, which is, of course, lack of adequate food, lack of access to education, health, etc., social marginalization, etc. 30 years back, 35 years back, they formed themselves into sanghas, that is women's committees in every one of 75 villages, and then together a Deccan Development Society as a federation of these sanghas. They brought back their traditional seeds into agriculture, switched completely back to organic, rejected all the hybrids and everything the modern system was giving them, including chemicals, etc. Collectivized a lot of their operations, shared the seeds, shared the knowledge, shared everything in the commons, and I'll come back to the commons in a while, and a whole bunch of other things I don't want to get into, a parallel public distribution system, grain banks, etc. And through all of that, actually managed to not just create enough food for themselves, these 5,000 families for the whole year, and some to sell in the market, but what they call food sovereignty. Anna Swaraj, which means complete control over everything to do with food. No control whatsoever with corporations or with the government in as something as. And in all of that, holding seeds and the earth as being sacred. And this element of sacred is something I'm going to try and run through this whole presentation. All the way across to the other end of the world, this is the Quechua indigenous community in Peru, in the Andes highlands. And here they actually have sustained their control over and their custodianship over a very large landscape, or what they call the biocultural sacred landscape, which incidentally is the origin of the potato. I went here in 2008 and I was stunned into complete speechlessness when they showed us 100 varieties of potato. Small purple ones, big red ones, I mean, all kinds of shapes and sizes. I mean, I'm used to this, I don't know, lump of something that we get the potato in India. But I saw that diversity. It was incredible. But along with that biological diversity, of course, is the cultural diversity linked to it, is the politics of controlling that landscape, is the women's knowledge being asserted, etc. Through all of that, again, asserting food sovereignty, and other aspects similar to the Dalit women farmers. A little bit south of that, this is the Sapara indigenous nation, one of the indigenous peoples of the Amazon, who have taken back control over that part of the Amazon from the corporations and the government, have refused any kind of mining and extractivist activities, and are trying to create a hybrid system of sustaining their own traditional systems of living with and within the forest, where everything has a spirit, including stones and the river and everything like that, their own cultural systems, their own knowledge systems, bringing back their language, which was destroyed by some forms of colonialism, but also relating to the modern world through forms of community-led medical or health ecotourism. I was there for 5 days and I saw how some of that kind of systems actually were trying to be worked. In fact, there are thousands of places around the world where nature is being protected through traditional or new means by communities, indigenous peoples and other communities, and through that also sustaining their livelihoods and their cultures. We call them territories of life. Go to Central Asia. This is another extremely inspiring example because it is an attempt to create a zone of peace within the most war-torn area of the world. Everybody talks about Ukraine as a war, but there's a constant war going on right here where Turkey, the Turkish nation state, has been invading, bombing, killing people in this quadri junction that you see here between Turkey, Syria, Iran, and Iraq, where the Kurdish ethnic community, along with others, is trying to create local democratic institutions which are based on genealogy, which is the ecofeminist principle. Some of the most amazing philosophies and ideologies and worldviews are emerging from the women there, and from one of their leaders who's been imprisoned for the last 23 years, Abdullah Öcalan, by the Turkish state. Back to India here, 90 villages, many of whom were part of that movement. The picture I showed you of the human garland across the Indravati River. After that movement, they said, why should we be protesting or resisting only the state? We also have issues to deal with within our own communities. We know that Adivasi communities have much more gender equality compared to non-Adivasi communities, but still there are inequalities. The women, for instance, are often not involved in the decision making in the Gram Sabhas or the village assemblies or the Adivasi systems, institutions. So the women asserting themselves, saying we want equality also in terms of voice, but then also beginning to ask questions about what are our cultural identities? What happens with our education system if it's only going to be taught by teachers from outside, and so on? What about our own languages? So this is a very interesting process called the Mahagram Sabha of Federation of 90 Villages. Over to Europe, the most capitalist societies in the world. And you begin to see over the last 20, 30 years, non-capitalist businesses asserting themselves, especially young people in cities saying, we want to create businesses, we want cafes, we want all kinds of businesses, but we don't want to run them on capitalist lines. We want to run them on lines where the society benefits. We get our revenues back, of course, our investments back, but not in terms of enormous profit making. And other forms. So for instance, this bottom left, right-hand side is a factory producing olive oil and other things in Greece, where workers run it on a completely democratic basis. They have this huge slogan on the factory which says, we have no boss. And remarkably, every worker gets exactly the same wage per hour of work, regardless of what work they're doing. Now, imagine if our economy worked like that, where the CEO of a corporation was getting the same wage as a mazdoor, a laborer on the street, right? I know it sounds too idealistic, but this is what they're trying to do. The school on the top right hand side, also in Greece, runs with very high quality teaching but very low fees. Now, think of that in India, right? That's all the private institutions that are coming up are very, very high fees. And then you have to struggle around for scholarships. Now, here, how do they do that? They do that because they're embedded within a community. The entire community has agreed to do time banking, which is to say that every person in the community offers something to the school free of charge. A little bit of administration work, a little bit of teaching, or something else, whatever they can offer. So you actually have expenses which are very low for the school, but the teaching can be very high quality. And so even poorer families can afford to send their kids to something like that. Alternative currencies, many different forms of what is broadly called the social and solidarity economy, which is trying to move itself out of the capitalist system. Again, back in India, another urban example, this is in Bhuj in Kutch, one of India's lowest rainfall areas, where Bhuj as a town exploded post-earthquake in 2001, and has continued exploding and has all the urban problems that all cities face. So here, 5 organizations, along with a number of especially in slums, but also in the middle class colonies, have got together to see how can their colonies be much better in terms of life. How can they take over control much more of at least things like water and energy and garbage management, but also how can they assert their right to the decision making and planning and budgeting of the city as a whole. So again, asserting democratic control, and through that more ecologically sound, more culturally relevant and more equitable kinds of solutions. This is in Copenhagen, anarchic community. The term anarchy, by the way, everybody thinks of as meaning disorder, etc. It doesn't mean that at all. Anarchy is actually a very good thing, which means you can self-determine yourself without having to have a government or a state helping to do that. So here, over the last 40 years, they've been trying to live a life in commons. For instance, if you have a house there, you don't own it. And if you die or want to go away, then your children don't inherit that house. So there's no private property. There's no inheritance of that sort. It goes to the next deserving family. And there are many other such movements in urban areas for trying to create much more sustainability, more equality. Now, if you go back quickly to the Dalit example and the Quechua indigenous example in Peru and many others, these were communities who survived much better in the COVID pandemic than did many of the others. And why was that the case? So we've actually put together 100 examples from around the world of COVID time resilience. And the main factors were collective control over the most important resources, whether it's nature or it's machinery or it's livelihood resources of other kinds, collective forms of decision making, sustained from the past or created in new ways, solidarity, expression. I mean, the feeling of solidarity and compassion with each other, localized economies so that there could continue to be exchange even in the midst of an economic lockdown, and some other such factors. And from that, we actually learned that, in fact, if we want to move towards the kind of systems, more just, more sustainable systems we want, then these sorts of lessons are really, really crucial for us. Let me take another 5-7 minutes to bring all of this together into what I think is the kind of frameworks emerging for transformation across the world. In the last few years, through a process called Vikalp Sangam, which I'll describe at the end, we've put together this thing which we call the flower of transformation, which has 5 spheres of life as petals: the political, the economic, the social, the cultural, and the ecological. There's a bit of an artificial distinction. I'm sure academics here will question me about this, but it's just to try and understand some reality, right? And we know that they're all interconnected, intersected. They're not separate from each other. Life is lived in the messy intersections between them. But if we think of it this way, and then at the core of this flower of transformation, a set of ethics and values, then here's a few of what's emerging in terms of the kinds of changes already being asserted and much more that needs to be done. In the sphere of politics, instead of thinking of politics or democracy only as elections or primarily as elections, in fact, what these communities are saying is that elections are not very important. They're there, will take part in them. What is most important is that we are born with power, and we will assert that power where we are. As a village, as an urban neighborhood, as an educational institution, students in an educational institution, as members of an NGO, wherever we are, whatever collective we are in, we will assert that power because it is inherent in us, right? And that is actually democracy. Go back to the origin of the word democracy. Demoscracy means power of the people, not power of the bureaucrats and power of the politicians we elect. Unfortunately, we've willingly given over all that power to folks sitting in New Delhi and so on. Whereas these people are asserting that no, we will, like the one village in central India called Mendhaleka asserted 30 years back, we elect the government in New Delhi and Mumbai. In our village, we are the government. हमारे गांव में हम ही सरकार, दिल्ली में हमारी सरकार. That's the slogan they came up with, and they're still living with that. The second aspect of that, of course, is that you cannot, having political power at that local level is not very meaningful if the economy that you depend on is in the hands of private corporations or the government. So again, the localization of economic power, the localization of basic needs rather than having to depend on somebody. And again, in the COVID pandemic, we learned this, right? If your food came from 300 kilometers away and that had to be shut down, then you suffered. If your food was localized, you didn't suffer. You still had that available. The same thing with other basic needs. So localization, bringing back the economy of not finance but caring and sharing, visibilizing the invisibilized role of women in the economy, right? None of what women do in the household, for instance, ever goes into the GDP calculations. Visibilizing the role of nature in the economy, bringing back, taking away from the privatization that is taking place and bringing back into the commons, economic resources, etc. And through all of that, then beginning to question GDP, economic growth as a measure of development, which is completely nonsensical, by the way, and actually bringing really meaningful measures of well-being, including, for instance, does everybody have access to clean air? A very important question sitting where we are right now in New Delhi, right? However much economic growth you might have, if you're going to be killed by bad air, what's the point? So all of this then becomes important as part of the economic transformations. The third sphere is social justice. And why this is very important is because you can have local political democracy and local economic democracy, but some of the traditional institutions, and we just saw this as an example in what's happening in Nagaland right now, can also be very regressive in terms of, for instance, gender inequality or casteism or others. So the struggles for equality from the local to the global also have to be very much part of this transformation. The fourth sphere, which I think for this conference is very important, is that of culture and knowledge. We know that we have a huge diversity of languages. I was stunned when I saw the People's Linguistic Survey of India a few years back, which Professor Ganesh Devi had coordinated. 780 living languages. Bhojpuri is not a dialect of Hindi. Kutchi is not a dialect of Gujarati. These are independent languages and we've not recognized them. We only recognize 21 or 23, right? And when education happens in only those 21 languages, we are wiping out entire languages which are libraries of knowledge. He told me, for instance, that Himachal Pradesh, I think somebody here, one of our speakers is from Himachal, has 230 different words for snow in, I don't know, 8, 10 languages or whatever, 7, 8 languages. Now, when only Hindi is taught in schools, we teach only in Hindi, we're actually wiping out that knowledge, which could be so important for dealing with climate change. Different sizes of snowflakes are called different things. Different times when the snow falls, it's called different things, etc. So this, I'm just giving languages. You can think the same with food, etc. Is so important. Then decolonizing the mind. If you go back to the image I showed you of the world, the map, I don't know if any of you thought, why is this upside down? Right? Because you have Africa on top and Europe below that. You actually start asking questions about where were the so-called normal maps, when and where were they made, and you realize that a lot of them come from the colonial times when Europe was put deliberately on top and was made to look much bigger than it actually is. I can go back to that map if any of you is curious about it. So beginning to actually also decolonize in terms of language, imagery, so many different things that we continue, unfortunately, especially in our schools and colleges, to still remain colonized. And we're actually now finding new ways of colonizing by removing elements of history, such as the Mughal period. The creation, the generation of knowledge, R&D, Rajeshwari's article in one of the books that we did is very good on this, looking at how do you begin to also democratize, commonize the generation and the transmission and the use and the storage of knowledge, of R&D, science and technology, etc. All of this then also means fundamental reorganizing of our education system. I think was it Geshe-la, you spoke about how it is not just about the brain, it's also about the heart, what the Dalai Lama spoke about. Yeah, I'll just finish. Gandhiji also said that. He said, Nai Talim, that it's the head, the hands, and the heart, right? So, how do we actually do that? And the original meaning of the word school, from the Greek word skole, meant learning with leisure. When 95% of India's schools are actually prisons, nothing to do with leisure. The commonizing also of our knowledge, instead of intellectual property rights, privatization, copyrights, etc. And that's why all of our books, for instance, are copyleft, Creative Commons. Please use them freely in any way which you want. It'll be nice if you give credit, but you don't need to take permission. You certainly don't need to pay us. And finally, of course, opportunities for spiritual advancement. If I was to use the word development, I would probably use it only here for spiritual development, but not falling into the traps of mainstream dogmatism that unfortunately has come into all of our religions. The fifth sphere is that of ecology, which is of course very crucial today. And here I go back to what I learned in school, which was the left-hand side figure of human beings as part of a pyramid of life, where human beings are on top. Note that it's the man on top and the woman below. That's what we learned in biology. What I think most religions and all Adivasi peoples, indigenous peoples have said is that we are a circle of life, in which all species are equal to each other. And so how do we actually bring back that thing of reintegrating ourselves? We are within nature, not separate from it, and the respect for all species, including, I think Kaveri spoke about rights of nature, not just human rights. If you put all of this together into a very interesting discussion that's beginning to take place over the last few years, and think of South Asia. Somebody spoke, I think one of you is speaking about dams in China, how that might be impacting India, right? So we've had this thing of actually dividing nature and natural flows into nation states and making boundaries and then increasingly fences and armies and so on and so forth. Ladakh and Tibet, for instance. India and Pakistan in the Thar Desert, India and Bangladesh with the Sundarbans thing, the Ganga separated into 3 different nation states. What that does is that each then nation state is free to do what it wants with that. Nevertheless, never mind what happens downstream to the neighboring, to the peoples in the neighboring countries. Can we start reimagining South Asia from the perspective of ecological flows and cultural flows and trade flows, which means then beginning to think of a borderless South Asia? Now, I could be held as a seditionist for saying this, but I still want to assert it, that I think if we really want to move towards peace and ecological wisdom, etc., we need to start thinking about levels of borderlessness, or at least porousness in borders. Finally, then I've just been given a signal saying I need to end. At the core of this flower of transformation is the most important part that I've learned from all of these initiatives, which is a set of ethics principles. I'm just going to put them out there. I guess we don't, maybe in the question answer, if there is one, we can get into this. But to my mind, this set of values, principles, ethics is diametrically opposite to what the currently dominant system tells us. It's completely opposite to what we're taught in schools, for instance. Just to go back quickly, in our schools, it's all about competition. what these transformations are telling us, it's actually about cooperation, right? Um, it's that physical labor should be treated with as much dignity, assuming that it's dignified. I'm not talking about a whole bunch of undignified physical labor that we impose on people, but as dignified as, say, mental labor, right? Um, the rights of nature, not just human rights. Non-violence, peace, harmony, compassion, interconnectedness was spoken about. And essentially, if you think, put all of this together, we're talking about worldviews that celebrate not money, not fame, not power, but life. And this is just so very different from our current system. But we see that it is possible. There are people who are asserting this. Swaraj is one of the notions that has come back into. It's a very old Indian notion, nothing new. But Gandhiji brought it back in terms of not just the freedom from the British, but to say that individual and community freedom, but with responsibility towards other people. And we've extended that to say not just other people, but other species also. So we assert our power, we assert our freedoms, we assert our autonomy and our self-determination, but not by doing things which will undermine other people's freedom and happiness and things. So, for instance, our consumption patterns have to be very critically challenged. There are similar notions all over the world. Most of these are available also in the book Pluriverse, so I won't go into them. This includes also the radical reinterpretations of religions, which is why we asked Geshe to write about Buddhism in the book. Others have written about the other main religions, and how within those religions also there's a lot of rethinking going on. How do we go back to the fundamentals of the spiritual values that all of these religions are based on? And then, of course, also coming from within the belly of the beast, things like degrowth and a number of others on which many people, including Rajeshwari and others, have been working. So I'm just going to end with this set of questions. None of us have all the answers. We need much more of this kind of churning and thinking and practice on the ground, etc., to be able to answer these sorts of questions. Who will take the lead? Do we need a state? If so, what will it be its nature and function? Do we need business? What would be that look like? What would our own academics, what sort of transformations do we need in our academics, in our spiritual traditions, etc.? And how do we achieve scale? Now, a lot of people ask me this question. You have these thousands of examples, but the macro system still remains the same. And this actually, to my mind, again, no easy answers here, but I think the ability to connect movements of resistance with movements of constructive alternatives, the ability to weave ourselves together across different landscapes, cultures, geographies, etc., is what helps or could help to create the scale that we want. Not by becoming single thing becoming bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, that's upscaling, and not by copying something exactly, because that's not going to work in your own area. So, but by what I call outscaling and then connecting across regions. Two initiatives we've started. I'm just going to end in a minute, sorry. Two initiatives we've started. I thought I had 35 minutes, so that's what I'm actually taking. Two initiatives we started is in India called Vikalp Sangam, which is to bring a lot of these sorts of groups, movements, communities, individuals together who are practicing or trying to conceive these alternatives across the country. So that includes physical confluences. It includes a website which now has 2,000 stories of this transformation. Any of you ever feeling depressed by the morning news, please shut down the newspaper or the television channel and go to this website. At least for a while, I think you'll cheer up, because there is some good news out there. And then similar thing across the world called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, trying to weave horizontally fantastic moments that are happening all over the world, and then trying to create scale through that kind of weaving. There's lots of networks and organizations across the world that are part of this, and a website which has also stories from different parts of the world. Two books, both of which are outside, in case you would like to purchase them. The one on the left-hand side is the one where Rajeshwari has her article on 40 people envisioning India in 2100, the ideal India that they want. Then coming back to the present and saying, how do we get there? What are the pathways? What are examples already available? And Pluriverse is the one with 100 examples from other parts of the world. This is my last slide. I'll just leave you to read it, because I think it's one of my favorite quotes from an Argentinian filmmaker, Fernando Biri, quoted by the poet Eduardo Galeano, about utopia. Because any time I give this presentation, people say, "Oh, but it's too utopian. We're never going to get there." But I think that's why this quote is so very important. We need these visions, at least to be able to get somewhere towards where we want to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ashish Kothari ji. Now we will have a question answer session, and each participants will get one question to raise the question to the our keynote speaker, and so that all the participants get equal opportunity. So before you raise the question, please introduce yourself.
I'm Professor Savita Kerkar from Goa University. It was a wonderful presentation, yes, of course. But there are lots of questions here, like human beings sometimes can't be convinced about certain issues, like especially when we have elections. Everyone hates a specific government, but at the last moment, they are paid off by so many people, and someone else wins the elections, and nobody blames themselves for someone being elected. So this is one example. Second example is during the COVID times, we've all of us blindly taken the vaccine for COVID. Nobody has thought about the consequences of COVID. That's also a human instinct. It was made compulsory to all human beings that we have to take COVID. Otherwise, you can't be in your working place. You can't live in a hostel. You can't travel anywhere. But so all of us took the vaccine. Now we are seeing the consequences of the COVID vaccine, where people are having heart attacks at a very early age. We have people dying from the age of 20 to 40. Very young people with unexplanatory, we can't even explain, but it's because of a heart attack. And that's because of the COVID vaccine, which they're relating that to. But this research is also hushed up. It's not brought open to the society. So how do it's a big problem, how do we convince human beings to be good? To be very ethical. It's sometimes very difficult. So it's easy to say this is a problem, that is a problem. Here, these people are doing very good things. Yes, that's a big study which we have to share with people. But at the last moment, everyone becomes vulnerable to certain things, and everything gets destroyed. So what do you have to say on this?
Yes, should we do one or should I take a few? Okay. Thanks, Savita ji. So obviously, yes, this is in our current situation. This is a big problem, and you gave 2 examples, and of course there are many more. So the kinds of transformations we're talking about cannot deal with these in the immediate. In the immediate thing, there are some things we can do. For instance, with the case of elections, people have been demanding various kinds of electoral reforms. One of the biggest would be that parties do not use their own resources, funds. That there be a central pool and every party gets an equivalent amount or some sort of proportion of that. Because one of the biggest problems is the generation and then the use of money, which is why now we have these stupid electoral bonds, right? NGOs can't take funds, but parties can take especially from corporate houses. So we need a whole series of electoral reforms as a short-term measure to deal with some of the sorts of problems you're talking about with elections. But in the long run, my point here is, and this is what, say, the villages of Gadchiroli are saying, yeah, we'll take part in the elections. But for most decisions that are important for us, we will be the decision makers. And we will force the government to actually comply by what we're saying. Otherwise, next year, we're not going to go for elections at all. We won't vote for any party. Now, that kind of, if in the last 75 years of independence, we had generated that as our main focus of democracy, then we wouldn't be in this situation of saying, okay, which candidate do I vote for, and then tomorrow will he or she do the right thing or not? Okay, so at least the next 75 years, let's try and do that, rather than continuing to focus on bringing some party into power. But meanwhile, fight for these electoral reforms. With the COVID vaccination, I think this is a very important example of the non-democratization of knowledge and technology. The more we fight for that, the more we say that things must be in the commons, must be in the open domain, all technologies and the the knowledge behind them, etc., instead of intellectual property rights, must be in the public domain, especially something as important as this. And the consequences of taking or not taking vaccines should also be in the public domain. In fact, at that time there was a court case arguing against compulsory vaccination, and the court actually said yes, it's not compulsory. Even the government said it's not compulsory. Unfortunately, institutions were saying that if you don't take the vaccine, you can't come to office tomorrow, or you can't sit in a public transport. So there were distortions of various kinds that happened, and unfortunately we didn't have the public power enough to be able to challenge that and to correct it in the way it should be corrected, including the hushing up of what you're saying, consequences of vaccinations. So this is a consequence of the non-democratic nature of the generation of knowledge and technology. And I'm sure some speakers will be talking more about that later. So these are struggles we have to constantly wage. We've just had this, just last week, in the environmental domain, there was a few years back something called Parivesh as a website that was set up, where all environmental impact assessments, etc., were, and documents relating to that were put up, and anybody from the public could go and download those. It's been shut down. The government shut it down last week, saying it's making companies vulnerable to knowledge theft, which is ridiculous. I mean, these are things that should be in the public domain. So now if I want to challenge a thermal power station or a chemical factory or whatever it is, I don't have access to the information anymore. I have to file an RTI. So they're actually misusing the RTI law to say, you want information, file an RTI. Instead of saying in fact, the RTI Act says that it has to be proactively put up by the government in the public domain. So this is what's happening, and we have to fight those things. Yes.
Sir, over here, sir, at the back, sir. My name is Sirik. Such a wonderful and enlightening presentation. Thank you, sir. I thoroughly enjoyed it. So my question is a very small question. You gave an example of Viomi, I think, worker factory in Europe, right? They were paid equally. So if every worker are paid equally, which worker would take more responsibility? So I'll give you an example. There was a study conducted where in a university, all the students were graded their average grade. So when there was an exam, the students who don't like to study did not study, and the student who liked to study studied. And when the grade came, let's say B plus average, the student who did not study, they were very happy because even without studying, they got B plus, right? The student who were very studious, they got B plus, so they were very sad because they were used to getting A, which they deserve because they put in the effort. And it continued for a few more times, and then the people who used to study, they did not study at all, because what's the point? Because I don't get what I deserve because I put in the effort. So in that context, how do there was a small example in a place, if you make it more prevalent in most our society, how do you think that would happen? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So the way it works with Viomi, and I'll give another example of how it works, is that there's all decisions are taken democratically by the workers. That is to say, all the workers are involved. So if a worker is slacking or is not doing what he or she is supposed to be doing, you have another 30, 40 or 100 workers who are actually going to ask you, why haven't you actually done what you're supposed to be doing? You're getting paid as much as I'm getting paid. You're not doing it, which is affecting my work, which is affecting our reputation in the outside society. So peer pressure begins to work. And then after a while, it's not peer pressure, but the trust that you have in each other and the sense of responsibility that comes in, because I know then that if I do something that's going to affect another 99 people, I shouldn't be doing that, right? It's the same thing. Like, I mean, people say this thing, it's kind of derogatory to Indians, but Indians in India will throw garbage out on the street. When they travel to Amsterdam, they won't. Why? So, either because you fear action, you get fined 100 euros, or because you find that everybody else is behaving, not that Amsterdam is a great city otherwise, but I'm just saying in this example, at least one is, that you find that people are behaving in a certain way, you also begin to fit into that sense of responsibility. Second example I'll give you, certification of organic food in India, organic produce. Now, either you actually get very expensive certification by corporations or the government as a farmer that you are organic and you can then sell your food as organic, or you have what is called the PGS, the Participatory Guarantee Scheme, where farmers cross certify each other. It's peer certification, much cheaper. And the way it works, because you can say the same thing, that they might cheat and they have an incentive for cheating because then they can sell their organic produce at a higher cost. But the way it works is, firstly, trust that you are actually adhering to the system. Secondly, that there are spot checks from anybody from outside, including consumers or maybe a government agency. And if any farmer gets discredited that you're actually cheating or that you have certified another farmer wrongly, then the entire system gets discredited. So again, both a combination of trust and faith and a combination of the consequences of not acting responsibly mean that PGS works really, really well. And in fact, it's recognized by the Government of India also as a valid certification. Now, if from childhood, this was the sense that was put into all of us, that I have a sense of responsibility towards all my fellow students, it would not be about my coming first and it doesn't matter what happens to the rest of the class. It would be that the entire class of 20 students needs to move up together. And if you're struggling as a student or being irresponsible, there will be another 19 students who are going to either help you to move up or put pressure on you not to do something that's going to negatively impact the rest of the students. Unfortunately, we are never taught in that kind of an atmosphere. The atmosphere is intense competition. So then the race is to the bottom line rather than to the upper line. This is why what you're saying exactly. So you can't change it in that microcosm without at least some larger level changes also taking place. And if you look at institutions like SecMol and so many others, I think I had a slide, I don't know where it disappeared, of alternative learning spaces in India. This is what they do. And they have produced the most fantastic results in terms of what the students have come out to do in society. And they don't have this problem at all. Nobody fails and nobody deliberately tries to undermine the system so that they can be lazy and still get good marks. Because the whole system in that school or learning institution will then be staring at you and you have to then behave responsibly. So this is what I would say. This is how it would work in all fields of society, I think.
Sorry to jump the queue. In this connection, one of the major questions is that I personally think that communism failed because of that. Communism, talking about the localization, talking about the equality in the society. So it failed. And in China, there's no communism now. It's not real communism. So wherever in the world, communism really failed because of the one factor. Because in a family should be the best of the best or the ideal situation where things should work on a basis of trust, love, and affection. Even in the family, there are issues. Issues because some children, they're more compassionate. Some children are very selfish. And when you are very selfish, your behavior is going to be very different. And this is not that you are given by your parents, this selfishness. It comes from somewhere. So because of this, if this is where this is a community, because of which all these lapses are bound to happen. So I think there's a major reason why communism failed. And what's your take on this?
Thank you, Geshe-la. I haven't really studied it that closely. I'm sure this must be one of the factors, but I have not seen any communist state, as in nation state that claims to be communist, to actually be communist in that. Communist in the sense of the final stage of communism that Marx spoke about, where in fact the state doesn't exist, which is the anarchy or the kinds of systems I'm talking about. Now, in these examples of, let's say, the Kurdish movement or the Zapatista or the Adivasi local self-determination movements, transformations take place right from that micro level of the family and the individual to the larger society. So again, if there is a child that's been, I don't know, wherever that selfishness, let's say, comes from, we don't know where it comes from. It's born in them or it comes from society, we don't know. But suppose it's there, there is a atmosphere in which that is dealt with, not through punishment so much, but in terms of the seeking of values, the learning, the explorations, etc., that take place. And then, and where even then some individuals don't, in that sense, behave responsibly, there are consequences, which are social ostracization or peer pressure or other sorts of things that come in. Radical democracy would have to be based on these sorts of systems, from the individual, the family, the small unit to the larger units, etc. Only then I think we're going to be able to see this. And this is, of course, again, what all spiritual faiths tell us, that the fundamentals of that has to be taught right from that childhood phase. So, but really, there's no communism. None of the states were actually communist in that sense of the word. Yeah.
We'll take two last questions.
Hello, sir. My name is Chimi Witten. I'm a research fellow at the National Maritime Foundation. So my question is related to the values that you have talked about, which is required to like in alternative transformation. But then when it comes to Tibet, all these values are almost all the values are deprived by the communist China. And so how do you then address the issues or climate justice that Tibetan people face? Your thoughts on it? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I guess the simple answer to that is you can't address them until the Chinese are occupying Tibet. So the struggles to free Tibet, of course, which hopefully many of us are part of or supporting, have to be there. And we do, I guess the signs of hope are other places in the world which have also struggled against occupation and for freedom and have been able to achieve it. And that's why I gave Kurdish also, because though they are constantly under bombardment, at least in a part of their region, they have been able to claim, to assert and achieve that kind of freedom. But they're not asking for a Kurdish state. They're saying, we don't want a Kurdish country, we just want a Kurdistan which has its ability to whatever. So I think if we think of through, and of course all the anti-colonial struggles that we've had to wage, I hope that over the next, I don't know, 2-3 decades, Tibet will be able to achieve the freedom and then go its own self-determination way as it should, as it deserves to.
May I? Thank you, Mr. Kothari. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation, especially the figures, the champagne glass, and the inverted world map and other figures. Even the ecological pyramid you have shown. Actually, we fall in one circle rather than human being the dominant on the top. Anyways, my question is regarding the knowledge system, the traditional knowledge system that, especially in our in the tribal areas that we have been carrying out for several hundred years. So if we see further, the traditional knowledge can be an intangible and a tangible knowledge. Now, in the race of development, in the race of education, the intangible knowledges which are really significant for the ecological, for the environmental conservation. So this rich intangible knowledges are rapidly, vanishing in the tribal areas. And moreover, when we talk about this intangible knowledges, what we call is the traditional ecological knowledge. So in most of the Buddhist, dominant belt like Ladakh, Sikkim, Arunachal, we have faith, we have belief and tradition in preserving this sacred ecological landscapes in the form of local deities, what we call is La and Lu, So these intangible knowledges are disappearing. So my question is, whom to blame? To the people who have adopted the policies or to the government who have implemented the policies? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I would say both, because while we can point our fingers to the government which has certain kinds of policies, I think insofar as we have a certain amount of power to resist and to assert our own, we are also responsible. So I would say both. But what is happening, I think, and this, you're absolutely right, this is a huge erosion taking place around the world, and especially the more the written form comes in, the more the oral forms disappear. And we know that a lot of the intangible heritage is actually the oral traditions, the paintings, etc. I think in many of the movements now, this is being reasserted. Storytelling, for instance, is coming back. We recently had a Vikalp Sangam on indigenous worldviews, and the Lepcha women had come from Sikkim and the Darjeeling area, and they were telling about how their traditions of storytelling and women shamans is actually being brought back so that they can be going through the entire community to tell stories about the river. And they also say that the river also tells stories. So to bring that back into the thing, and along with that, fight against big dams that are coming up on the Tista or other rivers. So sort of combining resistance with the revival of that kind of tradition. And the same thing with Lars and Luz. So for instance, we do a bit of work in Ladakh. And so to be able to bring that sense back, we need also in schools, in places like Ladakh or Tibet, to have this kind of storytelling coming back in, so that the teachers are not only the PhDs and those who've done their written whatevers, but in fact the local elder woman and man is also a teacher who comes to the school and talks about spiritual traditions, the spirits of the land, the spirits of the water, and these sorts of things. So I think we need to actually bring this back, and we can also use the UN, the UNESCO, this thing on intangible heritage, which is quite interesting and powerful. But we need to bring it down to the ground and say, okay, how do we do that in our own communities? And also force the government to accept these in the formal education system as being important. We now have at least a couple of universities which are also bringing Adivasi, Dalit women farmers, for instance, the example I gave you, or Adivasis, to the formal education, for the formal university system, and recognizing them as teachers, which then gives the students the opportunity of learning wisdom and knowledge from these people who may actually not even know how to read and write, but they are fantastic teachers in their own sense. So I think the more we do that, the more we...
The new education policy 2020, sir.
Yeah.
Regarding the preservation of old Indian traditional knowledges. For example, from this year in the Central University, I'm teaching in Delhi University. I'm Dr. Dorji. Sorry I forgot to introduce myself. There are three in my knowledge. There are three papers or courses they have introduced: Vedic mathematics, Ayurveda, and nutrition. And I don't remember the other one. But they have least focus in the tribal areas. Like for example, in Ladakh, Sovar Ikpa has been the local Amchi system. It has been practiced for the last 1,000 of years. But I think focusing in the tribal region would be another alternative to preserve this intangible. But they have not. The NEP 2020. There's nowhere having mentioned about the preservation of this intangible knowledges in tribal areas.
Absolutely. I mean, if I was to be frank, this particular regime is using tradition as a means of pushing down our throats one kind of cultural tradition. Let's be frank, Hinduism, or certain forms, not even all, certain forms of Hinduism. So other religious traditions and folk traditions, you're talking about people's knowledge, that's not in the focus. So why only Ayurveda? There are the Amchi system, there's Unani, there's so many others, right? Why only yoga? There's a dozen different forms of, either meditation or bodily kinds of things which are there across India and South Asia. So we need to also assert, that's why I said diversity, that when the government says, yeah, we will recognize tradition and we will bring it into the education system, fantastic, but, and that's what the NEP says, but why only one? Why not all the dozen that exist for medicinal systems or other sorts of things? These are again struggles that we have to, and we have to keep talking about it. But at least let's do it in our own systems. In Ladakh, as you would know, one of the struggles has been, why shouldn't there be also Bodhi in the education system? Why is it not there? But then there's been their own internal dynamics of that, which I don't want to get into. But other places, people are saying, no, we will also teach in the local language. In Kutch, for instance, now Kutchi is actually beginning to come into the schools. So locally also we need those movements, even as we kind of struggle against or guide the government into different policies.
Yes. We have skill development programs, we have vocational courses, and we have skill development program. In skill development program, you can put up this course. So any professor of the university can float a course. You can design it yourself. It's according to the expertise which is available so that you can teach the course. So if it's not there, you can introduce it, get it approved by your board of studies, academic council, and introduce it. If there should be takers for it. So you can float it actually.
One last one from a young person, maybe. Yes.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Ujjwal Pathak. I'm from Gulmohar University. Sir, my question is, you have mentioned about a factory in which there is no boss, and sir, everyone gets equal wages, and sir, everyone does. Sir, but sir, this is the practice which is practiced in a very socialist country. As a socialism, as a term, has been faded wherever it has been practiced, be it Soviet Union or any other country, sir. So how will we justify or promote this kind of act in our country, sir? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Well, firstly, let me clarify a misunderstanding. Greece is not a socialist country. It's a very capitalist country. This was in Greece. Okay. So they, in fact, when they did that, they had to struggle against the capitalist former owner of the same factory, and they had to struggle against the government. They're still struggling. In fact, right now they're having serious problems. So the government is trying to take over the land on which the factory exists. So if they could do that in the midst of a very capitalist society, there's no reason why we can't do it here. Here, at least some forms of broadly what can be called socialism or commons, let's say, still exists, right? Even though government has tried to destroy it rapidly. But there are still forms that exist. So there's no reason why we can't actually bring that in here. And there are examples in India also where workers, the producer companies, for instance, I can give you an quick example. There's a producer company called Dharani in Andhra Pradesh. About 2,500 farmers who collectively run that company. They sell their organic produce into the market. The revenues from that goes equitably to all the workers, all the farmers, and they take their decisions collectively. So we have examples of that kind here in India also. There's no reason we can't do that across all the sectors of the economy.
Thank you very much. And we are very sorry that we could not entertain more questions due to time constraint. And you can raise the question individually to Mr. Ashish ji separately during tea break or lunch break. Thank you. And now I would like to request Venerable Kishore Tamdila to kindly offer the kata and souvenir to our keynote speaker, Mr. Kashish Kothari ji. Thank you very much. And the next session, which is on the climate change, politics and policies, our view from the global south, will be starting in 5 to 10 minutes. And my colleague, Mr. Lekmila, will moderating the first session. And I would like to thank once again to our keynote speaker and our chairperson and our speakers, particularly our participants who are gathered here and giving us and sparing us time over here, and also watching live from YouTube and Facebook. Thank you.